Welcome back to Set to Success. Let us start our today's topic that is on leverage ratios. What is a leverage ratios? Any financial ratios can be called as leverage ratios, which shows how much debt an organization has taken. So this is the definition of your leverage ratios. Here we need to understand the another term which is solvency and liquidity. Solvency is the measure, the ability to meet your long term obligations, and liquidity is the ability to meet your short term obligations. So, liquidity we have covered like we have calculated the liquidity ratios, we have calculated the current ratio, we have calculated acid test ratio or quick ratio, cash ratio, or working capital. So, that ratio that ratio checked your short-term obligations, but here we are going to check our long-term obligations, whether the company is going to pay in the long term or not down the line, like 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years. In in leverage ratios we have financial leverage and we have operating leverage. So what is financial leverage? Financial leverage is the ratio that is calculated out of your debt component. Means what you do, you take borrowed funds, you use debt to finance the purchase of your assets or the investment or to increase your earnings. So this is what the financial leverage is, the use of debt or the borrowed funds. If the financial leverage is high, this means you have taken debt, your debt is high. If your financial leverage is high, the degree of financial leverage is calculated by two ways. You can calculate by earnings before interest and taxes, by earnings before taxes, or you can calculate by percentage change in net income by percentage change in EBIT. So this is what the financial leverage is. Now we have operating leverage. Operating leverage is the leverage that is created out of your fixed expenses. It's the measures of the proportions of the company's cost structure that consists of your fixed cost rather than variable cost. If your fixed cost is high, if your fixed cost is high, this means your operating leverage is going to go high. It means that your operating leverage will be high. If your fixed cost is less, your operating leverage will be low. So this is what the operating leverage is. Operating leverage is calculated by two ways. You can calculate by taking the contribution margin in the numerator and taking the EBIT, which is earnings before interest and taxes, in the denominator, or you can calculate percentage change in EBIT divided by percentage change in sales. Now let us understand the difference between your financial leverage and operating leverage. One, the financial leverage is created out of the debt component, but the operating leverage is created out of your fixed expenses. So you have to remember this, that one is out of the debt component and one is out of your fixed expenses. Now, apart from financial leverage and operating leverage, we have earnings coverage ratio. So what is earnings coverage ratio? It measures the firm's ongoing ability to generate the earnings that will allow it to service debt out of current earnings. So, earnings coverage ratio means that, for example, your earnings can cover your fixed charges, your earnings can cover your interest expense or not. So we in this earnings coverage ratio, we have fixed charge coverage ratio, we have interest coverage ratio. Interest coverage ratio is also known as time interest on ratio, and we have cash flow to fixed charges. So what is fixed charge coverage ratio? Fixed charge coverage ratio is, it's a way to measure how well earnings can cover your fixed charges. So how well your earnings can how will your earnings is going to cover your fixed charges or not. So what's your fixed charges? Your fixed charges are interest, your required principals, your repayments and leases. So it is earnings before fixed charges and taxes by fixed charges. So it measures how well how well your earnings can cover your fixed charges or not. We have in earnings coverage ratio, we have interest coverage ratio or time interest on ratio. So it's the way to measure how well earnings can cover your interest expenses. So what, how well your earnings can cover your fixed charges, how well your earnings can cover your interest expenses. That is taken as, that is calculated by earnings before interest and taxes by interest expenses. Another ratio in earnings coverage ratio, we have cash flow to fixed charges. So does the company have enough cash to pay the fixed charges they incur? So this ratio judges, do you have enough cash to pay the fixed charges? So in this we take cash flow from operations, we take the fixed charges, we take the tax payment and divide by the fixed charges. So apart from earning coverage ratio, we have capital structure ratio. So capital structure looks at your structure of the capital. So this is a way a firm chooses to finance its business. So how you are going to finance your business? Should the company, here the question is being asked that should the company obtain financing by borrowing? Either you are going to take loan or you are going to issue the shares or both. But the optimal capital structure that is recommended is that you should have a mix of debt and equity. Note, you don't go only for equity, don't go for the debt. So it includes sources of financing long term and short term. These sources can be in the form of debt or equity. So either you can take your debt or you can take equity or you can take debt plus the equity. Suppose the recommended approach is that you have to take a mix of debt and equity, which is called the optimal capital structure. In MCQ, if it is asked that what is the optimal capital structure, optimal capital structure is the mix of debt or equity. So what is equity? You know that equity is on in the form of common stock and preferred stock. So it is the permanent capital of enterprise, is the ownership interest in the firm. So how you are going to calculate your capital structure ratios? So capital structure ratio is calculated by taking the debt by equity. We have three ratios to calculate your capital structure ratios. We have debt to equity ratios, we have long term debt to equity, and debt to total assets. Debt to equity is capital structure ratio is it can be easily memorized. You have two, right? So it is like 2 means debt by equity, 2 means divide, long term debt divide, debt divide. So easily you can remember these three ratios. So debt to equity ratio is that what is debt to equity ratio? So how much a company assets are financed by creditors compared to the portion financed by the investor or shareholders. If debt to equity ratio is high, if the debt to equity ratio is high, this means the company relies heavily on debt. If the ratio is less, it means the company relies more on equity for funding. So this ratio checks whether the company relies on debt or the company rely on equity. So we don't have to rely on debt, we don't have to rely on equity. We should have a mix of debt and equity. So this way you can measure the company is having a mix of debt or equity, or the company is relying on debt or equity. Now we have long-term debt. In long-term debt, what we do, we exclude the current liabilities. We only check the long-term debt by the total equity. And in debt to total assets, we take total debt, current liabilities plus non-current liabilities by total assets. Total assets, which is total debt plus equity. So how much the assets are financed and owned by the creditors of the company, how much your assets is owned by the creditors of the company. So this checks your assets. So it's debt by total assets. So this is your capital structure ratio. So in leverage ratios, we have financial leverage and operating leverage. We have earnings coverage ratio, and we have capital structure ratio. So let us mark this topic as complete, and we'll proceed to the MCQ section of leverage ratio, so we can understand more deeper about the leverage ratios. Without doing the MCQ, it's like success in the CMA examination. So the most important is that you have to do MCQs, you have to do practice, you have to do lots of practice in the MCQ section. So let us complete the leverage ratio. So what we have completed 15% of your CMA part 1, CMA part 2, sorry. Now we have completed 50%. Let us see after completing the leverage ratios where we stand. So now we have completed 17% of your CMA part 2. So now we will move towards the MCQ section of leverage ratios.